it's really great being back in Sheffield. This is the first time I've given a talk in Sheffield since I left a long time ago, I think 1997. So this is a talk on the gift relationship. And I would like to start by telling you a little about a woman called Elisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum. Now, you probably never heard of her, but she was born in 1905 in St. Petersburg in Russia. And after she emigrated to the United States, she gave herself the name Ayn Rand. Now, some of you may have heard of her, but probably most of you haven't. She's not generally well known in the UK, but amongst some groups of people, she is a significant, even a revered influence. I'll give you an example. At the end of 2013, in Goldsmiths Hall in the City of London, several hundred bankers, economists, political advisors and business leaders came together to hear the annual Ayn Rand lecture organised by the Adam Smith Institute. And the talk was entitled, Ayn Rand, More Relevant Now Than Ever. And the audience heard a Mr. Christensen, who was the chief executive officer of a Danish investment bank, argue that the world is on the wrong track, and to conclude that Ayn Rand is the only answer, to which the audience responded very enthusiastically. Now, she died in 1982. Her influence is still considerable amongst bankers and others in the UK, but her influence is even greater in the United States. She wrote novels, including a novel called Atlas Shrugged, which she used to put forward her philosophical views. And in the 1990s, a survey done by the United States Library of Congress named that book, Atlas Shrugged, one of her novels, as the second most influential book in the United States, second only to the Bible. In 2012, Paul Ryan, who was the vice presidential candidate in the United States presidential elections, and who is still a prominent member of the United States Congress and prepares the Republican Party's budget proposals, he cites Ayn Rand as the major formative influence on his thinking. Another American, Alan Greenspan, who from the late 1980s was for 20 years the head of the United States Federal Reserve Bank, one of the most important, if not the most important, economic institution in the world, he was a friend and admirer of Ayn Rand. So how is she relevant to a talk on the gift relationship? Well, as I said, she was a Russian emigre, lived most of her life in the United States, and she has a particular significance for this talk and for us as Buddhists because she viewed altruism as a disease. She viewed altruism as a disease that is incompatible with freedom, with capitalism, and with individual rights. For her, altruism was a kind of primitive social instinct left over from our earlier evolution as humans. And she held the view that we may still be in evolution as a species and living side by side with some missing links. And these missing links could be found, she thought, in those people who fail to utilize their rational selfishness to its full potential. She deeply believed that each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest. And in the novel to which I've already referred, Atlas Shrugged, the hero, John Galt, exclaims, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." And Ayn Rand's conclusion was that if any civilization is to survive, it is the morality of altruism that men have to reject. Now, it's difficult to imagine a view more completely opposed to everything that Buddhism stands for. The Buddha exhorted his disciples to go forth for the good of the many, for the happiness of the many, out of compassion for the world, for the welfare, the good, and the happiness of gods and men. And we know that giving is central to the Buddhist path, and I'm going to return later in the talk to look more closely at Buddhism and giving and altruism. But to begin with, I want to take a closer look at how generosity and altruism are viewed by mainstream economists, to see whether or to what extent they share Ayn Rand's perspective that altruism is a disease. And to do this, I'm going to refer to a book published in 1970 called The Gift Relationship, from which I take the title of this talk. This was a book written by Richard Titmuss, who was a professor at the London School of Economics. And the book compared the blood donation systems then existing in the United States and in the UK. Blood donation in the UK relied on people giving blood voluntarily for no financial reward. Blood was given as a gift. Donations of blood were then used for unknown strangers who received the blood at no charge. So the UK system, then, and as I understand it basically still now, existed outside the market rules of economics and relied upon altruism, a spirit of generosity. Blood donation in the United States relied very much upon commercial blood banks that paid donors for their blood and then sold the blood on. People receiving the blood had to pay for it. So the system in the USA was market-based and relied upon monetary transactions. So what did Professor Titmuss find in his study when he compared the two systems? Well, first of all, he found that the quantity and the quality of the blood donated in the UK were higher than in the USA. In particular, the quality of the blood in the USA was poorer, because in a market for blood, those who had the greatest incentive to supply it for money were those with the unhealthiest blood. You have to remember, in those days, testing of blood was much less well developed than it is now. So especially drug and alcohol addicts and others would go and give blood in order to get money. They had the strongest incentive to lie about their medical condition. That was one of his findings. But Titmuss had a deeper objection to the commercialization of the blood donor system. He believed that commercialization of the blood donor system eroded the spirit of altruism and generally diminished the propensity of people to give to others. And in this way, the gift relationship in society was undermined, something which he very much regretted. What he feared was the general erosion of moral values in society by the crowding out effect of market values through the process of commercialization. By eroding opportunities for people to be altruistic, the culture of giving would be diminished, and others would have fewer examples of altruistic behaviour from which to learn. Now, his thesis and his argument did not go unchallenged by mainstream economists. One of his main critics was an American economist called Kenneth Arrow, a very distinguished American economist. And in his criticisms, Arrow relied upon two assumptions about human nature that economists tend to take for granted. The first assumption is that commercialization does not change people's propensity to be altruistic. What he argued was this: commercialization means that those who wish to buy and sell blood can do so, whilst those who wish to avoid the market and prefer to see blood as a gift can continue to do so and give blood for nothing. In this way, he says, everyone gains. He argued this. Economists typically take for granted that since the creation of a market increases the individual's area of choice, it therefore leads to higher benefits. Thus, if to a voluntary blood donor system we add the possibility of selling blood, we have only expanded the individual's range of alternatives. If he derives satisfaction from giving, he can still give, and nothing has been done to impair that right. And since in the US a person could choose to give blood as a gift or to sell their blood, this meant they had two options. In the UK, he argued, you can only give your blood, you can't sell it. So the freedom of the potential donor, in his argument in the UK, is restricted. And since two freedoms are better than one, the system that includes the market alternative, the possibility to sell your blood at a price, is superior to the one that denies that choice. This is the freedom of the market. So, quite a strong argument. He was challenged, actually, by Peter Singer. Some of you might have heard of him, a moral philosopher. And he pointed out that there are, in fact, three freedoms at stake here, not two. The freedom to donate blood for no financial reward, the freedom to sell blood, and a third freedom, the freedom to give blood as a priceless gift, whose value hinges solely on the need of the recipient because it cannot be bought. The freedom to give blood as a priceless gift. And Singer said that freedom was not available in the United States. It was available in the UK. So Singer concludes we have a choice to make. Do you dispense with the freedom to sell your blood, or with the freedom to give a priceless gift because it cannot be bought? And this is ultimately a decision about the kind of society in which we want to live. So that's the first argument and counter-argument to Kenneth Arrow. But I think in some ways it's the second assumption that Arrow makes, and which many modern economists continue to make, that tells us more about the mindset of modern economics. Arrow argues like this. He says, altruism and generosity are resources, and like other resources, their supply is limited, and the supply therefore needs to be economized. And according to Arrow, markets which rely on people acting purely out of self-interest save us from having to use up a restricted supply of altruism. Accordingly, if the supply of blood depends only on people's generosity, then there will be less generosity left over for other situations. I'm thinking this is deadly serious. Now, he said this, like many economists, I do not want to rely too heavily on substituting ethics for self-interest. I think it best, on the whole, that the requirement of ethical behaviour be confined to those circumstances where the price system breaks down. We do not wish to use up recklessly the scarce resources of altruistic motivations. He wasn't the last to argue this point. There's a man called Lawrence Summers, a senior economic advisor in the United States. He advised President Bill Clinton, and he more recently advised President Barack Obama. So he advised Democratic presidents, not Republican presidents. In between working for Clinton and Obama, he was the president of Harvard University. And it was at Harvard that he spoke on what economics can contribute to thinking about moral questions. And this is what he said. One of the things that bothers many people of faith about market mechanisms is the idea that there is something wrong with a system where we are able to buy bread only because of the greed or profit motive of the people who make the bread. Here I would be very cautious. We all only have so much altruism in us. Economists like me think of altruism as a valuable and rare good that needs conserving. Far better to conserve it by designing a system in which people's wants will be satisfied by individuals being selfish and saving that altruism for our families, our friends, and the many social problems in this world that markets cannot solve. So Kenneth Arrow's views from the 1970s live on amongst very influential economists of today. So we have two views of altruism in the economic world. The first and most extreme of Ayn Rand, who influenced people like Greenspan, the head of the United States Federal Reserve Bank. And then the second view of altruism, like Kenneth Arrow and Lawrence Summers, who do see value in altruism. It's not a disease for them. They see value in it, but they believe themselves to be preserving virtues like altruism for use where they are really needed by promoting selfishness in the operation of economic markets. And in many ways, I think it's this second view which is more insidious and dangerous, because we don't realise that this is what lies behind much of economics. Of course, for us, and anyone else, I think, not immersed in economics, this way of thinking about altruism and generosity and love as resources with limited supply, like a fossil fuel that is diminished with every use, it's completely bizarre. But that's the assumption that underlies a lot of economics. You don't need to be a Buddhist to see through this. You might have heard of the American political philosopher from Harvard University called Michael Sandel. I think he did the BBC Reef lectures once. And he has written a book called What Money Can't Buy. And in that he argues this: altruism, generosity, solidarity, and civic spirit are not like commodities that are depleted with use. They are more like muscles that develop and grow stronger with exercise. One of the defects of a market-driven society is that it lets these virtues languish. To renew our public life, we need to exercise them more strenuously. Unfortunately, free market thinking, as Sandel points out, is penetrating more and more deeply into our public life. And in his book, he gives us an example of how market thinking works. The example that Michael Sandel gives concerns immigration and refugees. And he talks about a man called Gary Becker. He's now dead, but he was a Nobel Prize winning free market economist at the University of Chicago. And he entered the debate about immigration as an economist. And what he said was this: he recommended that the United States should simply set a price and sell American citizenship for $50,000, maybe $100,000. Immigrants willing to pay a large sum of money, Becker argued, are likely to be young, skilled, ambitious, hardworking, and even better, are unlikely to make use of welfare and unemployment benefits. And Michael Sandel says, asking a refugee fleeing persecution to hand over $50,000 to gain sanctuary is pretty callous. But there's another market-based proposal that doesn't require individual refugees to pay money. An American law professor has proposed that an international body be established. And that international body assigns each country a yearly refugee quota based on its national wealth. So the wealthier the country, the higher the number or the quota of refugees the country is assigned. However, nations can buy and sell these quotas or obligations among themselves. So he gives this example. Let's say Japan is allocated a quota of 20,000 refugees per year, but it doesn't want to take them. Well, it could pay Poland to take them. That's just the example. According to standard free market logic, everyone benefits. Poland gains a new source of income. Japan meets its refugee obligations by outsourcing them to another country. And more refugees are rescued, perhaps, than would otherwise find asylum. So Sandel ironically asks, what could be better? And he answers, there is something distasteful about a market in refugees, even if it leads to more refugees finding asylum. But what exactly is objectionable about it? It has something to do with the fact that a market in refugees changes our view of who refugees are and how they should be treated. It encourages the participants, the buyers, the sellers, and also those whose asylum is being haggled over, to think of refugees as a burden to be unloaded or as revenue sources rather than as human beings in peril. What this example illustrates is that markets are not mere mechanisms. They embody certain norms. They presuppose and promote certain ways of valuing the goods being exchanged. Economists, Sandel says, often assume that markets do not touch or taint the goods they regulate. But this is untrue. Markets leave their mark on social norms. And this is the nub of Richard Titmus's original worry about a market in buying and selling blood. In the gift relationship, he argued that it's not just the selling of blood that leads to blood being contaminated. It's not just that blood gets contaminated in the selling of blood. People's minds and values are also contaminated. The place in society of important qualities like generosity and community is eroded to be replaced with selfishness and greed. Human beings and human qualities become commodities, things to be traded just like other commodities. So our modern economics and economic marketplace can corrupt our values and attitudes. And another way in which free marketeers corrupt our values is in their remarkable naked rejoicing and promotion of greed. Now, for me, the two most famous statements in support of selfishness and greed occurred in the 1980s. One was made by a man called Ivan Bursky, who was a real-life Wall Street trader, and the other was made by Gordon Gekko, a fictional Wall Street trader in the film Wall Street, played by Michael Douglas. In May 1986, Bursky, who was then very famous and very successful, making millions upon millions on Wall Street, he gave a speech at the University of California, Berkeley School of Business, in which he said to the audience, "Greed is all right, by the way. I want you to know that. I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself." And according to a newspaper report, the people in the audience laughed out loud and applauded loudly. Later that year, he admitted that he had amassed his wealth through illegal trading and went to jail. But his words lived on in the 1987 film Wall Street, in the character Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas. And there's a scene in the film where Gordon Gekko is trying to take over a company, and he's at the shareholders' meeting, and he gives this speech, and he says this: "The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms, greed for life, greed for money, greed for love, greed for knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind." Now, you might think that's a bit extreme, but at the end of 2013, London Mayor and leading British Conservative politician, now Member of Parliament, Boris Johnson, declared Inequality is essential to fostering a spirit of envy, and he hailed greed as a valuable spur to economic activity, and he called upon the Gordon Geckos of London to display their greed to promote economic growth. This is the man who people say is the future leader of the Conservative Party. And we can see greed at work in the remarkable growth in the pay levels of the leaders of major companies and financial institutions. Over the last 30, 40 years, there's been an explosion in the pay of leaders of major companies. So in 2011, the heads of United States companies earned on average 209 times more than the pay of their average workers. And it's a bit difficult to sort of get that into your head. What does that mean? It's just like the ratio is so huge, 209 times more. In the UK, we're not so extreme. It's only 130 times more. I remember a time when there was a famous management consultant in the 1970s, the 60s, called Peter Drucker. And he thought a sensible upper limit to the ratio of the earnings of chief executive officers of companies to their average worker was 20. We're now talking about 209 and 130 as a ratio. So, to summarise, greed is endemic in our modern economic system, certainly amongst those who have power. Amongst free marketeers, altruism, if it is not to be completely dismissed, is to be preserved for the more intimate and personal spaces of life, and selfishness is to be encouraged. Now, Buddhism offers a completely different alternative ethical system and worldview to that of the free market. We know that generosity, kindness and love can be cultivated and grown, just as Michael Sandel says, just like developing muscles with exercise. We know this. In the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the discourse on loving kindness, the Buddha urges us, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world, spreading upwards to the skies and downwards to the depths, outwards and unbounded, freed from hatred and ill will, whether standing or walking, seated or lying down, free from drowsiness, one should sustain this recollection. This is said to be the sublime abiding. This is why we practice the Metta Bhavana meditation, the cultivation of loving kindness, to grow and strengthen the virtues of kindness and love and diminish the power of self-centeredness and selfishness. Loving kindness is not a commodity in limited supply. It is a quality of mind that can be cultivated in meditation and that grows in strength with repeated application in everyday life. We know that the Buddha identified greed, hatred and delusion as root causes of our human predicament. The Metta Bhavana meditation is the antidote for hatred and weakens the delusion that we exist separately from others and the world around us. The antidote for greed is generosity, the practice of giving. The Buddha once commented, "Those who do not praise giving are fools." Contrast that with Ayn Rand. In her novel Atlas Shrugged, the hero John Galt founds a utopian community in which the word give is banned from the vocabulary of its members. So, if in the teaching of the Buddha, the practice of giving is the foundation and the seed of spiritual development. If we look at the earliest recording teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, we read time and time again that talk on giving was the first topic to be discussed by the Buddha whenever he was teaching. In the Pali Canon, the practice of giving is the first of the 10 perfections, and in the later Buddhism of the Mahayana, the practice of giving is the first of the 6 perfections. The perfections being lists of virtues to be cultivated by all those who wish to gain enlightenment. And Sangha Rakshita, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order and community, comments that it's as if the teaching is saying, you may not be morally scrupulous. You may not be able to meditate even for 5 minutes at a time. You may not dip into the scriptures from one year to the next. But if you aspire to lead any sort of higher life, then at the very least, you will give. And this practice is not just concerned with the act of giving something to another. It's about cultivating a personal quality of generosity, an inward disposition to give, a disposition that is strengthened by outward acts of giving. And it's interesting that studies of blood donors show that although their initial decision to give blood may be influenced by a variety of factors, such as the convenience of a nearby clinic or by an appeal for blood, over time, the sense of an inner moral duty and the desire to help or to act on a feeling of responsibility to the community becomes more dominant. And studies also suggest that learning to give in one context carries over into other contexts. So the cultivation of generosity directly debilitates greed and facilitates a flexibility of mind that helps to destroy delusion. The individual practices of metta and generosity that we practice and teach to others and that we put into effect in our daily lives are a small but vital part of the effort to counter the increasing erosion of moral values by free market economics. But we can do more. As a Sangha, we can do more as a Buddhist community to promote moral values and to counter market forces. And this is where the Buddhist idea of the dana economy comes in. It becomes very important. I think you know this very well here in Sheffield. A Buddhist Sangha can be a beacon, highlighting that there is an alternative to the selfishness of market fundamentalism that increasingly permeates our society. Basic principle of the dana economy is to give what you can and take what you need. The precise details of this may differ from one local Sangha to another, but its basic features are clear. We encourage people who come to classes to give what they can afford to help enable the spread of the Dharma. And in this way, the teachings of the Buddha are also open to anyone, regardless of individual financial circumstances. And the same principle of give what you can, take what you need, applies when it comes to the levels of financial support given to those whose job it is to work at Buddhist centres or at Buddhist businesses operating a dana economy. So the chairperson of a retreat centre or the managing director of a Buddhist business is treated the same as anyone else. They are financially supported according to what they need. They're not paid more because they have a higher position. And they give according to the best of their ability. And of course, dana is not just confined to monetary giving. We can give freely of our time and skills in many ways. So in this way, the practice of generosity challenges selfishness, encourages a culture of sharing, and encourages a basic ethos at the heart of Sangha, the Buddhist community. Before I conclude, I've given you, if you like, a right-wing view of altruism through the words of Ayn Rand. But especially as a former, well, I still think of myself as left-wing, as someone who comes from a left-wing background, I should be honest and balanced and acknowledge that there is amongst some left-wingers a critique of altruism. And I've met it, or at least we could say a critique of charitable giving. And I was reminded of this reading a blog by a man called Charles Eisenstein. Some of you may have heard of a book called Sacred Economics, which he's written. He writes a blog. And he's writing about this left-wing argument against altruism, and I think it's worth hearing because it's quite challenging, and his response to it is very interesting. This is how a left-wing argument against altruism might go. Acts of charity do nothing to change the exploitative system of global capitalism. On the contrary, charity, philanthropy, and individual acts of kindness only perpetuate the system. How do they do that? Because by ameliorating some of its worst consequences, acts of charity make capitalism all the more palatable. And they divert altruistic energy towards relatively innocuous goals instead of towards addressing the systemic foundations of injustice. They appease the conscience and make one's own complicity more acceptable. And they can even generate a codependent relationship with the needy, in which the charitable enterprise depends for its survival on the very conditions it ostensibly seeks to address. Quite shocking to hear that, but very interesting, I think. Eisenstein argues, though, you can invert the argument. To focus only on the big picture, on the system, is an escape from dealing with the immediate needs of the people right in front of your face. It's just an ideological cover for failure to look after your brothers and sisters. And I think there's some truth in that from my own experience, but I've heard this argument put, but I have to say I don't think it's widespread, but it's worth noting, and I would be dishonest if I did not draw your attention to it. It makes me reflect on how important it is to work for change at all levels, at the more intimate, personal, local and community level, and at the level of the system as a whole. Exemplifying compassion and giving at the personal and the communal level, and working for change at the level of the system as a whole, are not incompatible. They go together. You have this theme, transforming self and world. We need to transform self and world. And the bridge between self and world is ethics. In particular, the practice of the 5 precepts, especially in their positive form, with deeds of loving kindness, with open-handed generosity, with stillness, simplicity and contentment, with truthful and skillful speech, with mindfulness. These are what matter, both in our personal dealings and what we should expect of our leaders and what we should expect to be implemented at the level of the system as a whole, and to work for that. So to conclude, I want to tell you 3 very short stories, because I like stories. And sometimes I think they tell us a lot more than a normal teaching. 2 of these stories are Buddhist and 1 is non-Buddhist. The first story is Buddhist, and it's from one of my favourite books, a book called Japanese Pilgrimage by a man called Oliver Statler. And the book tells of his pilgrimage in homage to Kukai, the great Japanese teacher, around the temples of the island of Shikoku in Japan. And in telling this story, he brings in wonderful historical and mythical anecdotes. So Temple 24 of the Shikoku pilgrimage stands at the tip of Cape Ashizuri. And Ashizuri means foot stamping. So this is the Cape of foot stamping. So Statler asks, how did it get this name? Well, according to legend, long ago, an old monk came to the temple with a young disciple to act as his servant. And it said that the disciple put compassion and generosity above all else. Then one day, another young monk arrived, seemingly out of nowhere, and joined them for meals. And the young disciple always shared his portion with the newcomer. But eventually, the young disciple's master, the older monk, told him off, saying, "Once or twice is enough. You must not continue sharing your food so freely." So the next meal, the young disciple shared his food with his new friend for the last time, and then told him of his master's decision. And the newcomer then said, "Such kindness as you have shown me is unforgettable. Please come and see where I live." And they went off together, followed secretly by the master, who had become suspicious of what was happening. They went to the Cape, where they got into a rowboat, took up the oars, and headed south out into the sea. And the old monk cried out, "Where are you going without me?" And the young monk replied, "We're going to the realm of Canaan. We're going to the realm of Avalokiteshvara." And as the older monk watched, they stood up in the boat and turned into bodhisattvas. The old monk stamped his foot in frustration and grief, giving the place its name, Cape Ashijuri, the Cape of Footstool. That's the first story. The second story is much more recent. It's told by Alva Noe, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of California. And he tells how recently he arrived at a road toll, ready to pay the necessary cash, but his cash was refused with the words, "Those people in front of you, they paid for you." And he didn't know the people in front of him. He was puzzled. He writes, "Then it hit me. A stranger had paid my toll for me. And what's more, he or she had done it for no good reason, or rather, she or he did it for no other reason than to, as the saying goes, to pay it forward. I couldn't wipe the grin off my face. Once the reality set in that I'd been the target of a random act of kindness, I could not stop smiling. I felt so happy, so grateful. I felt blessed. I felt as if I were part of a community, a secret community of kind people." So that's the second story. The final story is told by Taitetsu Onu, who's died now, but he was a leading Pure Land Buddhist practitioner in the United States. And he tells this story about 3 grapefruits. In 1968, Ono and his family were visiting Japan. They were a Japanese-American family. And before they left, they received a gift of 3 grapefruits. And at that time, grapefruits were a very rare and very expensive fruit in Japan. They were just about to return to California, where grapefruits were abundant and cheap. So they decided to give away the 3 grapefruits to the wife's teacher at a flower arranging class. So they gave her the 3 grapefruits, and a few days later, they received a letter from the teacher. And Taitetsu Ono describes its contents. She wrote that she shared the first grapefruit with her grandchildren, who were thrilled with the fragrance and taste of an exotic fruit that they had never seen before. The second grapefruit she peeled and ate together with an old friend whom she hadn't seen for over 20 years, making the reunion a very special event. The third grapefruit she took to a hospital where her best friend was dying of a terminal illness. She hadn't eaten for more than a week, but when she saw the grapefruit, she wanted to try tasting just a little piece. When she finished the first piece, she asked for another, then another one, until she ate half the grapefruit. The family members watching all this were in tears, happy that their loved one was enjoying something to eat. The teacher thanked us profusely from the bottom of her heart for the 3 grapefruits. And Ono reflected that according to Huayan Buddhism, this is a Chinese Buddhist tradition based on a teaching known as the Flower Garden Sutra. According to Huayan Buddhism, a small act of giving has wider effects in an interdependent and interconnected world. And Anno concluded, no one can measure the effects of a single act of giving, for its repercussions are beyond our limited imagination. Thank you.
How important it is that we establish a different sort of community, the community that Vaddhaka described as a beacon and an exemplification of a different way of doing things, because who wants to be a human being in a society that's just ruled by greed and complete self-interest? So one of the things we might want to talk about is, well, how can we do that? How can we create that? How can we create more so than we've got that society, that Sangha, which is a beacon of a different way of doing things? And the second thing that occurred to me is, isn't it wonderful, random acts of generosity or random acts of kindness, and their ripples that go out and beyond our imagination. So you might want to talk about, well, how could we just do more random acts of kindness? What might we do in that? So you might want to do those, or you might want to just talk about the talk in general. So we'll split up into some smaller groups, and if those people have recently finished an intermediate course would like to go with Bodhinaga and Suryamati in the green room. If those people who would prefer to be in a mixed group would like to congregate initially in the red shrine room, and if the remaining men would like to stay up here and the remaining women initially go into the bookshop, we'll organise some groups from there. So, so let's split up into some smaller groups and discuss that really excellent talk. But before we do that, let's give Vaddhaka another